Hi, thanks for joining us on the Get Inspired Talks podcast. What you're about to listen to are highlights from a longer podcast. To listen to the entire episode, go to getinspiredtalks.com/podcast. Hi everyone, my name is Rod Jans, and you're listening to the Get Inspired Talks podcast. For this episode of the Get Inspired Talks podcast, we visit with Robert Scratch Mitchell. From being a top Canadian fighter pilot to becoming an actor and starting his own production company, Scratch has had to face some fears in life. In this episode, we discuss fear and how Scratch has used it as a guide and a motivator along his interesting career path as a top fighter pilot, actor, and film producer. Now please help me welcome Scratch to the Get Inspired Talks podcast.
I think ultimately the things we fear the most are the things that can probably give us the most success, because our physiology, our whole psychology of ourselves is set up to take the easy road. And it's through perhaps survival, going back to first principles of the human condition. I don't know, but I know in my case that anytime I've had some sort of life enriching moment, it's when I've stepped into that fear and leaned into it. And I was a 29-year-old F-18 pilot, and I was going to perform in front of 500,000 people. Generals are there, politicians were there, my fiance at the time, her family, everyone that mattered to me was watching this, in addition to those hundreds of thousands of people. And I remember that moment where I lined up on the runway. I went through my checks. My heart was racing. I was like, oh man, don't mess this up. And I was like, can I do this? And, there were some real stakes at what I was going to do. I was going to point an F-18 straight at the ground and miss it by a couple hundred feet. It's dangerous. But the pressure to perform, I think, was the greatest fear. But I remember this exact moment when I did my checks twice and I pushed the throttle forward. I lit the afterburners. I felt those two engines slam me into the back of the seat. And I went, I have this. And I felt just this overwhelming sense of power and control come through me. And I went, this is fantastic. This is where I belong. And I think had I not requested to be that demo pilot and pushed that level of flying to that, to my, out of my comfort zone, I wouldn't have grown from that. And then I was able to go on and lead the Snowbirds and do a bunch of things because of that confidence building moment there. And I even think going back as the Snowbirds, it took me a while. I was sort of stepping back a little bit. When I was selected as a Snowbird, it was expected, not only demanded, that you were going to do a lot of media coverage and you were going to be a public speaker at schools and whatnot. So you have to step up to that. In my first year, I stumbled through it, facing the fear a little bit, but it wasn't until later I said, no, this is life's opportunity where you can go and not just get through it, but you can embrace it and become good at it. And I accepted that challenge. And by the end of my snowbird tour, I was the go-to cameraman. And then subsequently in the Air Force, they're like, oh, okay, we have a documentary coming through, Scratch will do it. Because I found a place that I really was comfortable, that I never thought I would have been there in high school and my early days of flying. And then took that forward to the Snowbirds, where not only you're expected to do it once in a while, but you are the front person of the entire team, speaking at big events 3-4 times a week. And I swore to myself that I would never give a boring speech. And to do that, I prepared for 2 years before going back to the Snowbirds. I started taking acting classes, which was also a side passion of mine. But I said, well, this will give me some insight into myself and how to communicate, how to breathe. And I started taking Toastmasters classes. I said, I'm going to own this stage whenever I'm up there, so that I can feel like I'm giving the people that have paid all their money and the sponsors, that they're getting some value out of having the Snowbird guys stand up there and dress them. And that was a real important aspect of that job. And it really was about me saying, I can't do an ordinary job with this. I can't just get through it. I have to really lean into it so that I can be the best at it. I think as I've become older, I've been able to identify the areas of doing self-reflection. What are the areas I need to work on in myself? And I realized, okay, I have to work on breath control and vocalizing. So I'm going to go take voice lessons and in an acting school so that I can have that commanding voice and presence on stage, recognizing, okay, this is a weakness. And so I think you're right. It's about training, but it's training out of self-awareness, knowing where to train and what to train. As I've jumped into this film world, it's terrifying. It's terrifying to come home on a Friday and not sure if the paycheck's going to come, because it's an elusive industry. And having come from the military, where it was, very consistent, exactly what your wage is going to be every month. It's pushing through those moments and seeing those small victories where you go, no, this is why I do this. Don't be afraid, because you know that there will be a success around the corner, and the coffers will fill back up. And so I think it gives you that confidence to take that next level of that next jump into the next level of fear. I was a watch collector, and I had a couple very prized watches, and I ended up having to sell my favorite watch to make ends meet for a couple months, a year or two ago. And when I came home, I went, okay, remember this moment. This is a moment of personal failure. And then the next morning I woke up, I said, that's not a failure. I said, it's just a stupid watch. And I stopped collecting watches that same day, nor will I ever collect them again, because they seem frivolous to me now. And I went, wow, because they're really not important. What's important is the end goal and pushing through this stage of fearful moments financially and whatnot. Because I think ultimately, going back to what you said, is what does leaning into fear give you? You lean into fear enough throughout your life, it gives you, I think, that sense that, no, there is a good outcome on the backside of this fear. There's quite likely you can count on yourself to push through, because you've done it half a dozen times. And I think creating the patterns of addressing fear and daily habits, weekly habits, and what have you, prepares you for those bigger moments in life that I like to think that I took anyways. I think ultimately, though, I've seen the best in humanity. I've seen the worst scenarios of humanity, the loss of life. It gives you a perspective that life is precious, and so cliche, life is short. And I think that has motivated me to not just stand up there in front of a group and say, hey, I'm flying these airplanes right now at 30 some years old, and, go live your dreams. But ultimately you have to look in the mirror and say, are you measuring up to your own speeches to groups of kids? And I think that is, in light of all those successes and failures, tragedy and victories I've seen in humanity so far, it gave me the motivation to say, no, you have to do this.
One of the things that we've been asking all of our guests is for a challenge, just a simple challenge. What's something, if people are still listening after 40 minutes or however long we've been talking, right. What's something that people can do?
I really think the power in writing down goals is immeasurable. I think subsequent to that, writing down your top fears is probably going to give you some insight how your fears align with your goals. And I think that will be a pathway to your goals, is identifying what those immediate fears are. So write it down.
So that's a really interesting challenge. I mean, I think people do write their goals down, but I wonder how many people actually write their fears down. So we'll see. One of the things that we're doing with the Get Inspired Talks podcast and Get Inspired Talks is we have a page called the GI Action Challenge. So I hope people will go there. And when we post this episode with Scratch, we'll put his challenge there, and people can go there and make comments and that sort of thing. And we'll send you the link to Scratch so that you can check in and maybe talk to some of the people that make comments there as well. That would be great if you'd be willing to do that.
I'd be honored to.
Good. And how can people get in touch with you?
I'm at Scratch at scratchmitchell.com. At Scratch Mitchell on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, and or speedbirdproductions.com. There are all links on any of those sites that one can reach me. I'd be happy to talk airplanes and filmmaking.
Awesome. So yeah, if people are listening right now on iTunes or on SoundCloud or YouTube, we will have those links on a show notes page on the getinspiredtalks.com website as well. So again, Scratch, great discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure entirely. Thank you.
You've been listening to a highlight video from the Get Inspired Talks podcast. For the complete podcast, please go to getinspiredtalks.com/podcast.